Kid shows up at his own funeral, then his mom learns the shocking truth. When he unexpectedly showed up at Billy's funeral, the somber mood of the day was shattered by shock and surprise. The mourners who were ready to say their last goodbyes were dumbfounded and speechless, their jaws falling open, their eyes wide open at his presence. But they're about to be much more shocked. "Billy, how are you here?" Jennifer asked while closely holding her son. Billy answered, appearing just as confused as everyone else. "I don't know, Mom," he said. Jennifer and her husband made the decision to find out the truth about the circumstances surrounding their son's remarkable return, as the other mourners struggled to comprehend what was happening. She started to investigate what happened to her kid, called the police, and talked to everyone who could have knowledge of what was going on with her son. What had actually happened to Billy? How is he still alive? Billy was a little child with an infectious love of life and a bright smile. He was just 4 years old when his parents were informed that he was terminally ill and only had a few months to live. Billy and his family were devastated by the news, but they were determined to cherish the remaining time together. Billy's parents made the decision to spoil him as much as possible. They took him on trips to far-off locations, taking him to all the places he'd always dreamed of seeing. In an effort to make up for the time he'd never get to spend with him, they also got him all the toys and presents he could possibly want. Billy's health started to decline over the course of several months, and his parents realized their time together was running out. Despite their sadness, they were also appreciative of the time they had shared with their kids, since they knew they would cherish these moments for the rest of their lives. Finally, the day nobody wanted to come arrived. Only 6 days after his 5th birthday, Billy, the young kid with the infectious grin and love of life, passed away. While Jennifer, his mother, was devastated, she was adamant that her son's funeral be up to her standards. Jennifer worked tirelessly to plan the perfect farewell for her son. She picked out the most beautiful flowers, the most touching music, and the most fitting words to say goodbye to her beloved child. She wanted to make sure that Billy's funeral was a celebration of his life and the joy that he had brought into the world. The day of the funeral arrived, and a large crowd gathered to pay their respects. Jennifer stood at the front of the church, tears streaming down her face as she said a goodbye to her son. The funeral was a beautiful and emotional tribute to Billy's life, and everyone left feeling a sense of peace knowing that he was finally at rest. But then something happened that no one could have ever dreamed. Just as Jennifer was about to lay a final rose on her son's casket, Billy suddenly appeared. Everyone in the church gasped in shock, and Jennifer rushed to her son's side, overjoyed to see he was alive. How is that possible? Billy was alive! The news of this sudden appearance at his own funeral spread like wildfire, and everyone was in disbelief. How is this even possible? No one could explain the miraculous event that had taken place. Jennifer and her husband were shocked when their son Billy suddenly appeared during his funeral. Everyone at the funeral was stunned. It seemed like a miracle, but they soon discovered it was a shocking revelation of a sinister plot. Jennifer and Jon were overjoyed to have their son back in their arms, but they were also filled with questions about how he'd escaped. They'd heard he'd been locked up in a house for 3 days, and they were desperate to know what had happened during that time. He began to tell them his incredible story. He said that he'd been locked up in a small room with no windows and had been given very little food or water, but despite these conditions, he refused to give up hope. Instead, he used his resourcefulness and determination to find a way out. He'd worked tirelessly, searching the room for anything he could use to escape, and finally, after 3 long days, he'd managed to find a loose board on the floor. With the help of his own strength and cunning, he'd pried open the board and crawled out through the small opening. He then made his way back to his hometown, arriving just in time for his own funeral. Despite the circumstances, Jennifer and Jon were filled with pride and amazement as they listened to their son's incredible story. They could hardly believe that he'd managed to escape from such dire circumstances and return home on foot, all on his own. They were grateful to have him back in their lives, but they still needed to make sure that the people responsible for his disappearance were brought to justice. They must find out as quickly as possible who kidnapped him. As they looked at their son, they were filled with a sense of awe and gratitude. They knew they were lucky to have him back in their lives, and they were determined to make the most of every moment they had together. But they still needed to do one more thing. Jennifer and Jon have really only had bad experiences with the police. Jon has a criminal past which he prefers not to talk about, but they know they have to inform the police about the situation. After all, it's their son. Jon's past included a dark and haunting secret he kept hidden from the world. After serving time in prison for multiple burglaries, he knew he'd never fully escape the judgment and stigma that came with his criminal history. Jon tried to start anew and leave his past behind, but it was never that easy. Finding work was a constant struggle as employers were quick to dismiss him once they discovered his record. It was tough, but Jon persevered and kept trying to make an honest living. It wasn't until Jon met Jennifer that he felt like he could truly start over. She didn't judge him for his past and was supportive of his efforts to move forward. They fell in love quickly and decided to start a family. Billy was born less than a year after they met. Jon couldn't have been more grateful for the life he had now. He had a loving partner and a beautiful son. He didn't want to risk losing any of it, so he kept his past hidden. Jon learned a valuable lesson through this experience. He realized that hiding his past would never allow him to fully move on from it. He needed to come to terms with what he'd done and make amends. He doesn't want to transfer his bad behavior to his son. Even if he doesn't like the police, he should call them in, so he did. He gathered all his courage and grabbed the phone. With Jennifer beside him and Billy playing in front of him, he called the police. He tells them what happened to his son. How the policeman on the other side reacted, he hadn't expected. Apparently, the police had already learned what was going on with Billy. They'd already set up a special task force working on the case 24 hours a day. Jon and Jennifer didn't know how to thank them. The police worked tirelessly to track down the individuals behind the child smuggling organization, and it wasn't long before they got a break in the case. They received a tip about a suspicious house in a quiet neighborhood. The anonymous tip said that several young boys were being held in the house, and the police were determined to find out the truth. The tip was vague, but they had reason to believe it could be the house where Billy was locked up for days. As the police approached the house, they noticed there were traps set everywhere. The house was surrounded by tripwires and other traps that could easily harm anyone who wasn't careful. The police quickly realized this wasn't going to be an easy task. The first team of police officers to enter the house was met with gunfire. They quickly retreated and called for backup. The entire neighborhood was now on high alert and everyone was watching as the events unfolded. The SWAT team arrived and began to make their way into the house. They were met with more booby traps, but they managed to disarm them as they went. As they made their way through the house, they could hear the sounds of young boys crying and screaming. Finally, they found the room where they were being held. The boys were all huddled in a corner, terrified and crying. They found 5 boys lying on a mattress. Next to the mattresses were food scraps and other debris, but they found more. Inside the house, they found the doctor who'd pronounced Billy dead. The doctor was taken into police custody, and a wealth of evidence was gathered from the house that linked him to the organization. But there was one more man inside the house. They also quickly arrested the man who'd been holding the boys captive. He was a known criminal on the run for years. He'd been using the house as a hideout and the young boys as his own personal slaves. The news of the doctor's arrest was met with relief and joy by Billy's family and the public. The discovery of the house and the arrest of the doctor brought a sense of closure to the traumatic events of Billy's disappearance and gave hope to others who had suffered similar injustices. The trial against the doctor and his organization finally began after several months of investigation. The courtroom was filled with journalists, family members of the victims, and curious onlookers. The atmosphere in the court was tense. The doctor and his accomplices were charged with kidnapping and human trafficking, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Many of their victims came forward to testify, and their stories were heartbreaking. The trial lasted for several weeks, and during that time, the media was all over it. The story of the doctor and his organization was front-page news, and it was the talk of the town. Everyone wanted to know how these people could have gotten away with something so heinous for so long. As the trial progressed, it became clear the doctor and his organization were guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including witness testimony, documents, and recordings. It was impossible to deny what they'd done. Finally, the judge read out the verdict. The doctor and his organization were found guilty on all charges and were given substantial sentences. The doctor was sentenced to life in prison, and the members of his organization were each given lengthy prison terms. Billy and his parents were very pleased with the punishments the judge had given. They'd waited a long time for this day, and it was a moment of closure for them. They knew they would never be able to forget what had happened to them, but they could take some comfort in the fact that the people responsible were held accountable. With the individuals behind the child smuggling organization behind bars, Billy and his family were finally able to put the traumatic events of his disappearance behind them and focus on the future. But that wasn't so easy. Billy thrived in his newfound happiness. He made new friends and excelled in school, and he was grateful every day for the love and support of his parents. He'd been through a lot in his young life, but he was determined to make the most of his second chance, and he did. As the years went by, Billy grew up into a successful and happy young man. He graduated from college with honors, and he landed his dream job. He was proud of all that he'd accomplished, and he was grateful for the second chance life had given him. As for his parents, they couldn't have been more proud of their son. They'd been through so much together, but they were grateful to have each other and their health. They lived their lives to the fullest, enjoying each other's company and cherishing their memories of the journey they'd been on together. The story of Billy's return and the subsequent events had been a long and difficult journey, but it had also been a triumph of the human spirit and a testament to the power of love and determination. Billy and his parents had faced their fears and overcome their challenges, and they lived happily ever after, with memories to last a lifetime.